My name is Dorothy Langford. I am 67 years old, and on the 14th of March, at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, I sat at my own dining room table while my daughter-in-law leaned across it and whispered 4 words to my son that she believed I could not hear. She was wrong. The words were these: "Put the old hag in a home and take the house." I want you to understand something about the moment those words reached me. I did not gasp. My hands did not shake. The tea I was holding did not spill. I simply became very still, the way the surface of a lake becomes still after a stone has passed through it and disappeared entirely, and you would never know, looking at it from a distance, that anything had been disturbed at all. That stillness was not an accident. That stillness was 14 months of preparation, paying off in a single exhaled breath. She did not know I had already sold the house to a demolition crew 11 days earlier. She did not know that the wire transfer had cleared on the 3rd of March at 9:22 in the morning for $219,000. She did not know that I had spent the previous 14 months preparing for exactly this moment, building something in the dark while she was busy designing her version of my ending. She did not know anything about what I had done because she had never once in 4 years taken me seriously enough to wonder what I might be capable of. I set my cup down. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the grain of Harold's kitchen table and I thought, there it is, the confirmation I had been waiting for, the word she had been using for me in private, the word that told me everything I needed to know about how she saw me, about how she had always seen me, about what all of those careful, cheerful, calculated Sunday visits had really been building toward. Old hag. I thought, thank you, Renata. You have just made every single thing I did in the last 14 months feel exactly right. This is that story. Before I go further, I want to stop and ask you something directly. What part of the world are you watching or listening to this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know. These stories travel farther than I ever expect them to, and something about knowing where you are sitting while you listen matters to me. And if you are someone who connects with stories about women who are quietly dismissed, underestimated, and treated as inconvenient, who then take their time and build something that cannot be dismissed at all, please like this video and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. It takes 5 seconds, and it means more than I can tell you. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I was born in Dayton, Ohio in the winter of 1957, the second of 4 children in a household where money was something you did not waste and work was something you did not discuss, because it was simply the ongoing condition of your life. My father, Gerald, worked the assembly line at a plant that made automotive components for 31 years. He never missed a shift. My mother, Ruth, cleaned houses during the week and cooked enormous Sunday meals that the neighbors could smell from the street. They were not glamorous people. They were not interested in glamour. They were interested in doing things properly and making sure their children understood that the only things worth having were the things you built yourself, through time and effort and the specific discipline of not needing to be seen while you worked. I carried that lesson with me into every decade of my life. It became the thing no one could take, not because I was guarding it, but because it was simply who I was. I did not know, at 22, that it would be the thing I needed most at 66. These things are never apparent in advance. I married Harold Langford on the 4th of June, 1981, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church on Maple Avenue, with 43 guests and a reception in the church hall that my mother and her friends had decorated with flowers from the garden. Harold was 26. He was an electrician, the quietest man I had ever met, someone who thought carefully before he spoke and who had the particular quality, rare in anyone, of meaning exactly what he said and nothing more or less. He read novels at the kitchen table. He listened to jazz on Saturday mornings. He never once raised his voice in our home in 38 years, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned, as I had, that the people worth speaking to were already listening. We bought the house on Birchwood Drive in Cloverfield, a suburb 40 minutes outside of Columbus, in April of 1986. We paid $112,000. It was a 3-bedroom colonial with a detached garage, a wraparound porch, hardwood floors that needed refinishing, and a backyard that felt, in those first spring months, like the most generous piece of land either of us had ever been given custody of. We planted a vegetable garden the first summer. We painted the shutters together the second summer, standing side by side on separate ladders with our roller trays balanced on the steps, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Harold refinished the floors in the living room one August while I stained the back fence. We hung the porch swing that fall and never once agreed on what color it should have been, though neither of us ever repainted it. We raised Kevin in that house. Kevin Robert Langford, born in the spring of 1983, who spent his childhood running the length of that backyard with the neighbor's dog and reading comic books in the garage and growing into a man who was, at his core, decent and conflict-averse and more susceptible to the path of least resistance than either Harold or I had fully anticipated when we were raising him. We loved him without conditions. I still do. That is not in question. Harold passed on the 18th of August, 2019. He was 64 years old. A cardiac event, the doctor said, the kind that does not announce itself in advance and does not leave any time for preparation. He was in his chair by the sitting room window, the old leather chair he had owned since before we met, with a John le Carré novel open on his lap and a cup of coffee cooling on the side table. The coffee had not gone cold enough yet. That was what the paramedic said. He had not been gone long. The grief of that is not something I will try to hold up to the light here, because it belongs to me and to Kevin and to the 38 years Harold and I had together, and I do not think grief of that particular depth is meant to be examined in public. What I will say is this: I stayed in the house on Birchwood Drive. I stayed because Harold was in every inch of that house. In the floors he refinished, and the porch he repaired, and the garden beds he dug with me in the springs, when the ground was still half frozen. I was not ready to leave it. I had no obligation to be. Kevin was 36 when his father died. He had been married to Renata Voss for 4 years at that point. Renata was 33, a mortgage broker at a firm called Hartwell Capital Partners. Sharp and organized and perpetually well-dressed in the manner of a person who understood that appearance was a form of argument. She had quick eyes and a ready smile and the habit of speaking in a way that made conversation feel like a series of items being processed. I did not dislike her when Kevin first brought her home. I was cautious, as one tends to be when a stranger arrives in the life of someone you love, but I was genuinely cautious, not hostile. And I made every effort to find the common ground that a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law are supposed to build in the early years. The effort was not equally reciprocated, though I did not understand the shape of that asymmetry clearly until much later. Kevin and Renata had one child, my granddaughter Madison, born in June of 2012. Madison was 7 when Harold died, and she grieved in the particular way that children grieve, suddenly and completely, and then in a rush back to the ordinary, in a way that was both heartbreaking and exactly right. I loved Madison without reservation and still do. She is 13 now, taller than her mother, with Harold's gray eyes and a way of asking questions that suggests she will someday be a person who takes very little at face value. I find that encouraging. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in the Riverside Commons neighborhood of Glendale, 22 minutes from Birchwood Drive. Kevin drove a dark blue Lexus that was 3 years old. Renata drove a white Range Rover that was 2 years old, and that she had, I knew from Kevin, financed at a rate that made him quietly uneasy. They belonged to a country club they did not often use and a neighborhood association they attended quarterly. Their life looked from the outside like a life that was entirely sufficient. I was only slowly coming to understand that it had, in some fundamental way, been extended in my direction as a claim. The pattern began subtly, as these things do. In the first year after Harold's death, Kevin came every Sunday without fail. He would arrive by 11 in the morning, and we would eat lunch and walk the neighborhood and sometimes just sit in Harold's kitchen with coffee, and it was not comfortable exactly, because grief is never comfortable, but it was ours and it was honest. Renata came about half the time in that first year. She was pleasant on these visits in a way that was careful and measured, and I accepted that she was trying. By the second year, the Sunday visits had become twice monthly, and the calls had become weekly rather than twice weekly. I understood this as the natural progression of a family settling back into its own rhythms after a loss. I did not take it personally. I had my own rhythms to maintain: my garden, my walking group, my book club that met on the second Thursday of every month at the library on Westfield Avenue, my neighbor Louise Pratt, who was 68 and a retired schoolteacher, and who had become, in the years since Harold died, the person I was most honest with about how I was managing. By the third year, the dynamic had clarified in ways I was only beginning to name. There were 3 specific moments that I documented, and I mean that literally. I documented in the small blue notebook I had taken to keeping in the drawer of my nightstand, because I am a woman who was raised to be precise about things that matter, and this had begun to matter. The first was in November of 2021, Thanksgiving. Kevin and Renata arrived at noon with Madison and a store-bought pie and a bottle of wine, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, while Kevin and Madison were watching football in the sitting room, I found Renata in the hallway outside Harold's study with her phone in her hand. She was not on a call. She appeared to be measuring something with a camera, or the measuring app, pointing it at the doorframe and the ceiling and the walls. When I asked what she was doing, she looked up with perfect composure and said, "Just admiring the bones of this place, Dorothy. Honestly, with what the market is doing in Cloverfield right now, this property is worth a fortune compared to what you and Harold paid for it. You're sitting on something really valuable." She said it like a compliment. I filed it as information. I wrote it in the notebook that evening. She is mapping the property. She has been here before, but tonight was different. The second moment was in February of 2022. I slipped on the back porch step on a cold morning, a thin layer of ice I had not noticed, and I came down on my left hip and the palm of my right hand. I was not seriously injured. I was bruised and shaken, and I called Louise, who came immediately, and Louise drove me to the urgent care clinic on Route 42, where they confirmed nothing was broken and sent me home with an ice pack and instructions to rest. I called Kevin that afternoon because it seemed the reasonable thing to do, and he came over within the hour, which I appreciated, which was the right thing to do. But before Kevin had been in the house 30 minutes, Renata had already called him twice. On the second call, Kevin stepped to the far end of the kitchen and spoke quietly. But the kitchen on Birchwood Drive was 31 feet from the back wall to the dining room entrance, and I had 37 years of acoustics memorized. I heard her say, with no ambiguity, "She can't manage that property alone, Kevin. At her age." This is exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about. I was 65 years old. I had managed that property alone, maintained it, paid the bills, tended the garden, had the furnace serviced, had the gutters cleaned, had a plumber in twice for minor issues, and had done all of that entirely independently for 2.5 years. At her age. I wrote it in the notebook that night. Kevin said nothing to push back. He said, "I know," and changed the subject. That is also information. The third moment, and the clearest, was June of 2022. Kevin and Renata had come for a Sunday barbecue, a warm day. Madison in the backyard with the dog from 2 houses down. Kevin was at the grill with a beer, relaxed and happy in the particular way he is when the weather is good and no one is asking anything of him. I had gone inside to get the extra serving dish for the corn, and I passed the hallway just as Renata was standing at the entrance to Harold's study, which I had kept exactly as he had left it. His books on the shelves, his reading lamp, his notebooks stacked on the corner of the desk, his reading chair, and Renata was on the phone, standing with her back to the door, speaking in a voice she considered low enough. She said, "It's an estate asset, Sandra. He just doesn't want to push her on it yet. Give it another year, maybe 18 months. But she's not going to live forever, and Kevin's the only child, so it's straightforward." A pause. Then, "No, she doesn't know we've talked to anyone. That's the point." I stood in the hallway with the serving dish in my hands for perhaps 10 seconds. I heard her laugh at something the other person said. Then I walked back to the kitchen, took the corn out of the pot, arranged it on the dish, and went outside. I said nothing. Kevin caught my eye over the grill and I smiled back. I was pleasant for the rest of the afternoon. I waved them off from the porch at 6:30. I went inside. I called Louise and I said, "I need to tell you something." Louise listened to all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I am going to give it some thought." I gave it some thought until the 14th of September 2022, which was a Wednesday. Kevin called at 9:45 that morning and began a conversation I could tell he had rehearsed. He mentioned gently that he and Renata had been meeting with a real estate attorney. "Just to understand the landscape," he said. "Just to be informed." He said the word informed 3 times. He mentioned that there were assisted living communities in the area with waitlists, that Sunrise Meadows in Westland had an excellent reputation, that financially, with the house, everything could be structured in a way that would be very comfortable for me. He mentioned that Renata's contact could do a complimentary market assessment of the Birchwood property. He was so careful. He was so obviously reciting. I listened to every word. I said, "Kevin, I appreciate you thinking about this." I said, "Let me give it some thought." I hung up, and I sat at Harold's kitchen table, the one we had bought at an estate sale on Fernwood Road in the summer of 1989 and refinished together on a Saturday afternoon with our sleeves rolled up and the radio on, and I did not cry. I did not scream. I just sat there with my hands flat on the table, and I thought about Harold. I thought about what Harold would have said. Harold would have said, "Dot, you built this life. Don't let anyone walk you out of it on a schedule that isn't yours." Harold would have said it quietly and once, and then gone back to his novel, because that was how Harold operated. He stated the truth, and then left you room to decide what to do with it. That was the moment I stopped being the woman who was waiting for the situation to change, and started becoming the woman who was going to change it herself. I got up from the table. I picked up the phone, and I called Patricia Hollis. Patricia had been Harold's attorney first, handling the estate and the will and the various practical matters that follow a death. And in the process, she had become mine as well, because she was precise and unflappable, and because she had been in the room when Renata had asked, at the estate closing, 3 pointed questions about the disposition of the Birchwood property in the event that Harold's estate were reopened. Patricia had answered the questions cleanly and professionally, and had not commented on them in my presence, but I had seen her face in the moment before she answered, a particular compression of her expression that I recognized as professional restraint applied under some pressure. When I called her that September morning, I said, "Patricia, I want to understand every option available to me regarding my property, and I want to move without notifying Kevin or Renata until I am ready." Patricia said, "Dorothy, I have been waiting a considerable time for you to make this call." We made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia walked me through the full landscape. I could sell. I could gift. I could establish a trust. I could convert equity. Each option had its own set of conditions and outcomes and timelines. We spoke about what I wanted from the result: financial security, independence, and the removal of the house from the equation entirely, because I had come to understand that as long as the house existed as an asset I still held, it would be treated as an asset that was in the process of being transferred to Kevin and Renata, and every future interaction between us would occur in the shadow of that expectation. I wanted to remove the shadow. I wanted to close the book that Renata had been writing in my name without my consent. Patricia arranged for 3 independent appraisals. The assessments came in at $212,000, $217,000, and $226,000 respectively, reflecting the significant appreciation the Cloverfield corridor had experienced in the past 8 years. The numbers confirmed what Renata had said on the phone that June evening about the value of the property. It was a considerable sum. It was the sum that Harold and I had built, slowly, over 37 years of maintenance and attention and care. Patricia presented 7 potential buyers over the course of November and December. I took my time with each one. I am not a person who decides quickly, and I do not consider that a limitation. 2 were residential developers looking to build single-family homes on the lot. 3 were private buyers, one of whom was a young couple who walked through with a particular reverence of people who intended to love a place, which moved me more than I expected it to. 2 were land acquisition companies working on behalf of a regional developer named Aldercrest Properties, which had been quietly purchasing lots along the Birchwood corridor as part of a mixed-use residential project that had been approved by the County Planning Commission the previous spring. One of the land acquisition companies, Meridian Land Partners, came back with the cleanest offer and the strongest terms. They were not buying the structure. They were buying the land, the house, Harold's colonial, the house where Kevin had learned to walk and where Harold had died in his reading chair, and where I had spent 37 years of my life, would be demolished. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it on the couch in the sitting room with the lights off one evening in late December, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, the grief of it, the finality of it. And then I thought about Harold's voice saying, "Dot, the life is not in the building. The life is in you." I called Patricia on the 2nd of January and I said, "Let's move forward with Meridian." The negotiations took 6 weeks. Patricia was thorough and unapologetic about the pace, which is what I paid her for. Meridian wanted a 30-day close and a vacancy deadline of the 15th of April. Their final offer was $219,000, cash with no contingencies. I signed the purchase agreement on the 21st of February at 11 in the morning in Patricia's office on the 9th floor of a building downtown. Sitting across from the Meridian representative, a methodical man named Douglas Haynes, who shook my hand at the end with a kind of businesslike respect that I found entirely adequate. The wire transfer cleared on the 3rd of March at 9:22 in the morning. $219,000 deposited into an account I had opened the previous 1st of January at the Cloverfield Community Credit Union on Halstead Avenue. An account opened in my name alone, an account that Renata Langford had no knowledge of and no legal access to, and no way of finding unless she were looking for it, which she was not, because she had never once operated under the assumption that I might be doing anything that required looking for. While the sale was proceeding, I began making my living arrangements. Patricia referred me to a relocation specialist, a woman named Gail Torres, who worked with seniors transitioning from owned homes, and Gail was brisk and kind and practical in a way I deeply appreciated. She brought me listings for 6 different apartment buildings within a 10-mile radius. I had specific requirements. I wanted to be within 20 minutes of Kevin and Renata's neighborhood. Because I was not disappearing from my son's life, I was renegotiating the terms of my presence in it, which is a different thing entirely. I wanted a building with security and maintenance included. I wanted something with outdoor space where I could garden. I wanted it to be mine, fully mine, not a place I was placed or managed, but a place I had chosen with my own eyes open. The Willowmere was the 3rd building Gail showed me. It was 8 minutes from Kevin's house. 4th floor, east-facing apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small study, a galley kitchen with good light. The building had a doorman named Bernard, who had worked there for 11 years, and who greeted me at the entrance with the kind of unhurried steadiness that told me the building had been managed well. There was a community garden on the 4th floor terrace accessible to all residents, 12 raised beds and a long trough for herbs and trailing plants. And I stood in that terrace garden in the February cold and looked out over the rooftops and thought, this is where I will plant tomatoes. I signed a 1-year lease beginning the 1st of April for $1,480 per month. I arranged with a local moving company to come on the 12th of April, 3 days before the Meridian deadline. Then I went home to Birchwood Drive, and I began, very quietly and very deliberately, to dismantle the life I had been living there and prepare it to move with me. If you are still watching, I want to stop here and speak to you directly for a moment. If you have found yourself in a version of what I am describing, if you have felt yourself being managed toward an outcome you did not agree to, if you have overheard your own future being discussed in a room you were sitting in, If you have been treated as though the inconvenience of your existence were a logistical problem rather than a human fact, I want you to know that the most powerful thing you can do in that situation is the thing no one expects you to do. Build. Build quietly. Build without announcing it. Build in the time and space they have dismissed as irrelevant because they think you are too old or too tired or too grateful to build anything anymore. Drop a comment below and tell me what you are building. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now. New stories every single day. In February and March, I sold what I did not need and donated what remained. I was systematic about it. The furniture that belonged only to the house, the pieces Harold and I had bought for specific rooms and that would not survive the translation into an apartment, I sold through a dealer on Westfield who came and assessed and made fair offers and removed things on a schedule. I gave Harold's tools to Kevin, choosing a Sunday morning when Renata was at a fitness class and driving them to his garage myself, and watching Kevin stand in his driveway with his father's toolbox and say nothing for a full minute. And that was one of the harder moments of those months, but it was also the right moment because it belonged to Kevin and Harold and to no one else. I kept Harold's reading chair. I kept the kitchen table. I kept the quilt my mother made the year Kevin was born. Blue and yellow squares, soft from decades of washing. I kept Harold's books, all of them, 2 full banker's boxes, because the idea of giving them away felt like giving away his handwriting. Since Harold had written in the margins of everything he read, and those margins were the closest thing I had to ongoing conversations with him. I kept the framed photographs from the hallway and the sitting room. I kept my garden tools. Everything else I either sold or released, because I was not running from a life. I was translating it, and translation requires selection. Kevin called once in late February to check in. I told him I was well and keeping busy. He asked with what, but in the distracted way of someone who expected the answer to be ordinary, and so I said, clearing some things out, and he said, that's good, Mom, and the conversation ended within 8 minutes. Renata texted me 4 times between February and mid-March. Each message was a variation of just thinking of you, with a small heart emoji and no follow-up question. I responded warmly and briefly to each one. I gave her nothing to read into, which was not difficult because she was not looking. The 14th of March fell on a Tuesday. Kevin had called the previous Thursday to say he and Renata would like to come by on Tuesday afternoon, that they had some things they wanted to discuss. He said it in the way that a person says something they have prepared, and I said that Tuesday would be fine, and I made a note in my calendar, and I spent the days between in a state of particular quiet that I recognized as the internal equivalent of having everything in order. They arrived at 1:30. Kevin drove. They came through the front door and sat at the kitchen table, and I made tea. The house was different than it had been on their last visit. The walls were clear. The shelves were mostly empty. There were spaces where things had stood for years and did not stand anymore. Kevin looked around and said, "Looks like you've been cleaning up in here." And I said I had been simplifying, that it was something I had been wanting to do for a while. He nodded and accepted it, which told me everything I needed to know about the quality of his attention to the specifics of my daily life. We spoke for 35 minutes about things that did not touch the subject they had come to discuss: the weather, Madison's volleyball season, a news story about the City Planning Commission, Kevin's firm. I watched Renata during all of this. She was pleasant and composed, but she had the particular tension of a person who has an agenda and is waiting for the right moment to open it. Her hands were very still in her lap. She glanced at Kevin twice in the first 10 minutes with a look I had learned to recognize over 4 years of Sunday visits, the look that said, "We are getting there. Be patient." Kevin cleared his throat at a few minutes past 2. He said that he and Renata had been doing some research, that they had found some really wonderful options, that there was a community in Westland, Sunrise Meadows, that had an opening, that it was very well reviewed, that the units were actually quite beautiful, that financially, with the house, everything could be structured in a way that would give me complete security, that they just wanted me to know that they had been thinking about this and that they wanted to be there for me. He was doing his best. I will always acknowledge that he was doing his best. I said, "Tell me more." I wanted to hear all of it. I wanted to hear every word. I held my teacup in both hands and I watched Kevin speak and I thought, this is the conversation you have been rehearsing and I have been preparing for it for 14 months. And you do not know that, and in approximately 3 minutes, you are going to know it. Kevin paused to glance down at his hands. He was getting to the part about the house. I could feel it arriving in the shape of the pause. And in that pause, Renata leaned slightly forward, angling her body toward Kevin, and in a voice that she calibrated with precision, a voice just below what she calculated as my hearing threshold, she said, "Put the old hag in a home and take the house." She said it the way a person says something they have said before, many times, in private, and that has become, in those repetitions, ordinary. She said it with a familiarity that told me it was not a slip of frustration. It was a settled phrase. It was the real version of all the careful conversations, the phrase that lived underneath the research and the community tours and the market assessments and the planning attorney consultations, the phrase that told me what I had known for 2 years but had not yet heard, confirmed in those exact words. I heard every syllable. I did not react. My hands did not tighten around the cup. My face did not change. I breathed in and I breathed out, and I set my cup down on its saucer with a sound as light as a whisper, and I looked at Kevin and then at Renata, and I said, in the same voice I had used at every parent-teacher conference Kevin ever had, calm and clear and without a single tremor in it, "I want to show you both something." I stood up. I walked to the kitchen counter where I had placed a manila folder that morning, a folder I had prepared the previous evening at the kitchen table. Everything in order, the documents facing the same direction. I brought the folder to the table and I opened it and I laid 3 documents out in a row between us. The first was the signed purchase agreement with Meridian Land Partners dated the 21st of February. The second was the wire transfer confirmation dated the 3rd of March for $219,000. The third was my signed lease agreement for the apartment at the Willowmere, beginning the 1st of April, with my name on it and no one else's. I said, "I sold the house 11 days ago. The new owners are a land development company. They take possession on the 15th of April. The structure will be demolished in May as part of a residential development project. The proceeds are in an account in my name. I have already signed a lease for an apartment 8 minutes from your house. Everything has been handled." I sat back down. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at Kevin first, and then at Renata, and I waited. The silence that came after that was the most complete silence I have ever been present for. Not the silence of shock exactly, though that was part of it. The silence of an entire architecture of assumption simply ceasing to exist. The silence of a room in which everything had been moved while no one was looking and no one had noticed until this exact moment. Kevin looked at the documents. He looked at them the way a person looks at something written in a language they recognize but cannot in that instant process. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked at the wire transfer confirmation and then up at me, and there was something in his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. It was the face of someone who has just understood something true about a situation they thought they had fully understood. It was not a comfortable face. It was the right face. Renata looked at the wire transfer confirmation for a very long time. She looked at the number. She looked at the date. She looked at the account information, which told her nothing useful because it was an account she did not know existed. The color moved out of her face slowly, and then all at once, the way warmth leaves a room when you open a window in January. She looked up at me and I watched her arrive at the understanding that the plan she had been building for 2 years, the plan that had involved attorneys and market assessments and community tours and quiet phone calls, and the word asset spoken about a house that still had a woman living in it, that plan no longer had an object. The object was gone. The object had removed itself. She said, "Dorothy, we were only trying to help." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about all of it. I thought about the November measuring with her phone, and the overheard call in June, and the estate asset remark to Sandra. and the words she had just said across my kitchen table in the voice of a person who had been saying them in private for some time. I said, "I know exactly what you were trying to do, Renata. I heard you." She had nothing to follow that with. She knew what she had said. She knew I had heard it. She picked up her teacup and put it down without drinking from it, and she looked at the table. Kevin found his voice. He said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me? We could have talked about this. This didn't have to happen this way." His voice cracked on the last three words, not dramatically, not performatively, but in the way that cracks happen when something genuine is breaking. I did not harden toward that sound. I felt it because it was real, because Kevin is my son and his distress is not nothing to me. But I also let it be what it was, which was the natural consequence of choices he had been making for 2 years in a marriage that had, on this particular matter, been making choices for him. I said, "Kevin, I want to be very clear with you about something. You and Renata had a plan for my house and my life that you developed over at least 2 years. You consulted real estate attorneys. You researched assisted living facilities. You had a contact standing by for a market assessment. You discussed my home as a financial asset in phone calls that I was close enough to hear. At no point in any of that planning, not once, did you sit across a table from me the way you are sitting right now and ask me, directly, what I wanted. What I wanted for my own life, what I was capable of managing, what my intentions were. Not once." I paused. I made sure he was looking at me. I made my own plan. I executed it carefully and legally and entirely on my own. That is not a punishment. It is not an act of anger. It is simply what an adult does when she has been treated as though her preferences and her intelligence are inconveniences to be managed rather than facts to be respected. The afternoon moved into early evening. Renata stepped outside onto the porch and did not come back in for 25 minutes. Kevin and I stayed at Harold's table. We talked in a way we had not talked since the months right after Harold died, without performance, without agenda, without the texture of Renata's presence organizing the shape of Kevin's responses. He cried, quietly and without theater, the way men cry when they have been holding something for a long time and the container finally gives. I did not cry. I held his hand across the table and I told him that I was not angry at him. I told him that I was disappointed, that there was a difference, and that the difference mattered to me. I told him that what I had done was not intended to hurt him, but to protect myself, and that if he thought about it honestly, he would understand that those were not the same thing. He said, "I should have asked you. I should have just asked you what you wanted." And I said, "Yes, you should have." And now we both know that. I was moved into the Willowmere by the 16th of April. The movers came at 8 in the morning, and by 4 in the afternoon, Harold's chair was in the corner of the living room on the 4th floor, and the kitchen table was in the kitchen under the window. And the quilt was on the bed, and the photographs were in a box that I was not yet ready to hang, but that I knew exactly where I intended to put them when I was. I stood in the empty living room on that first evening, and I let the light come through the east-facing windows, and I thought about 37 years on Birchwood Drive, and I let myself feel the full weight of leaving a place that was the physical record of the best years of my life. I let myself feel it, and then I let it settle into the place in me where things are kept, but no longer carried, which is a different place, and finding it takes time. Meridian sent a photograph in May. The house was gone. There was open sky where the roofline had been, the old maple still standing at the edge of the lot, the concrete of the driveway still in place. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I thought about Kevin's first steps on those hardwood floors. I thought about Harold at the grill on summer evenings. I thought about my mother's quilt on the spare bed, waiting for guests. And then I thought about Patricia saying, "Dorothy, you are not losing a house. You are reclaiming a life." And I thought she was exactly right. Kevin calls twice a week now. He comes on Sunday mornings and we walk in the park 2 blocks from the Willowmere, a park with old maples along the path, and a pond where the light is different depending on the hour. And we get coffee from the shop on Linwood Avenue, and we sit and we talk. It is not the relationship we had when Harold was alive, because nothing is what it was when Harold was alive, and I do not expect it to be. But it is honest. It is ours. It is built on the actual terms of who we both are, rather than on the pretense that those terms are secondary to a plan. Renata and I have spoken 4 times since March. The conversations have been careful and short, and not yet, if I am truthful, fully resolved. There is ground between us that needs more time and more honesty than we have yet put into it. I do not carry bitterness toward her, because bitterness requires constant maintenance and I have better things to do with my attention. What I carry instead is clarity, a clear understanding of what I will tolerate, what I require, and what I will never again pretend I did not hear. I believe that over time, if Renata and I are both willing to do the work of honesty, we will find something workable. I am in no hurry. Patience operated with intention is the most precise instrument I have ever used, and I have no plans to put it down. The tomatoes on the 4th floor terrace are extraordinary this summer. I planted 12 plants in late May, varieties Harold and I used to grow on Birchwood Drive, Early Girl and Brandywine, and a cherry variety called Sun Gold that Harold had been particularly fond of. I have harvested more than I can eat alone, so I have been leaving bags of them outside my neighbors' doors with small notes, and this has led to Thursday evening gatherings on the terrace that have become, quietly and unexpectedly, one of the genuinely good things in my current life. My neighbor on the right is a woman named Carol, 63, a retired librarian who reads faster than anyone I have ever met. My neighbor on the left is a couple, Marcus and Deshawn, who moved in the same week I did and who have a terrace plot next to mine where they are attempting to grow cucumbers with mixed results. These people know nothing of Birchwood Drive or Renata or the sale, or any of it. They know me only as the woman on the 4th floor with the extraordinary tomatoes, and that is, I have come to understand, exactly the kind of introduction I needed. I want to speak directly to anyone who has watched this far and who recognizes some part of their own life in what I have described. If you have been discussed in the 3rd person while you were present, if you have heard the word asset applied to something that was your home, if you have been managed toward an outcome that was someone else's preference and not your own, if you have been called, in a voice just low enough to seem careful, something that told you exactly how you were being seen, I want to say this to you clearly. You are allowed to build your own plan. You do not need permission. You do not need to announce it while you are building it. You do not need to time it to anyone else's schedule or limit it to what other people expect you to be capable of. The plan they are making for you is only inevitable if you participate in it. Stop participating. Build in silence. Build with patience. Build with the particular discipline of someone who knows that the work does not need an audience to be real. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. That is not a platitude. That is a lived thing. I know it because I did it. Over 14 months, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary life, in a house on Birchwood Drive in Cloverfield, Ohio, while the people who were designing my ending were still busy writing the early chapters of it. Harold's reading chair is in the corner of the living room at the Willowmere. The light comes across it in the late afternoons in a way that is different from how it came on Birchwood Drive, but not inferior to it, just different. The way everything in a new life is different rather than lesser if you look at it honestly. I put my hand on the arm of the chair sometimes when I pass it. Not every day. Just sometimes. It is enough. I have one question for you, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Have you ever stayed completely silent about something you were building, not because you were afraid, but because you understood that the silence itself was the strategy? And did the silence work? Leave your answer below. I want to read every single one. To everyone who has watched this story all the way through, I want to say something that I mean completely. Thank you. You gave something real today. You gave time, which is the one thing none of us can make more of, and you gave it to Dorothy's story, and to this channel, and to the idea that these quiet, careful, patient stories deserve to be told and heard. There are millions of women like Dorothy, women who are in the middle of building something right now, in the silence, in the hours that no one is watching, and they need to know that someone understands what that requires. If this story reached you today, please share it with one person. Not for the channel's sake though, that matters. For the sake of whoever in your life needs to hear it. Subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. We are here every day with a new story. We are not going anywhere. And neither, it turns out, are the women who build in silence. Welcome to the channel. We are glad you are here.